Dan Nelson is our resident historian, and the neatest thing about Dan's stories, and we've kind of had like this connection of the story throughout the last week, and understanding. I think this story and the main character in the story, this female, is very interesting because we realize that women didn't have a lot of rights back then. We also realize that women didn't have a lot of ability to take themselves and to change their situation. We also realized that certain people had a lot of power and were able to do whatever they wanted to do, and that same thing doesn't seem to change now. And so this story is very interesting. There's obviously some change in it, but also it shows us how some things haven't changed and some things have changed a lot. Dan, great to have you on Live Your True Life Perspectives. How are you doing?
Doing great. It's a beautiful weekend again here.
It is beautiful, and I'm looking forward to the rest of your story because, women's rights have changed quite a bit, and it's interesting how we see her life, and then we also interesting to see how it actually progressed and changed, and she was actually to create a better life for herself.
Yep, she absolutely took some, as you would say, in tying into this episode, she took some personal growth steps to change her situation. It was very difficult for women to change things back then. I mean, basically got married and the guy called the shots, and then you had, a family was generally created, and sort of like, you worked through that the rest of your life. There wasn't, other options to consider.
Very powerful. So what happens this time to her, and what is the ending on this?
All right. Well, basically, what you had is keep in mind that she was mistreated by her first husband, who was twice her age. So he abandoned her with her 3 kids. She took up with the neighbor next door, who was 20 years older, and now she's a mother of 10, and she's looking to leave her provider. So she asked to be separated by the court from George Gardner, and he stopped troubling her. So she's over George. And the court, finding out they were never, ever properly married, got quite upset, fined both of them, and they passed a law to say, prevent that from happening again. Meanwhile, Herod became an avid Quaker convert. So she joined the Quaker movement, which was not particularly well accepted by the authorities back then. So in 1658, she stepped into the public view, and just to quote an observer here, Herod Gardner, mother of many children, and an inhabitant in Newport, Rhode Island, being moved by the measure of God to carry her message towards Weymouth, took with her the youngest 2 children, one that fed upon her breast. A journey that, considering her condition, no one could have expected her to accomplish, but her faith was made strong through weakness, and according to the will of God, she finished her testimony at Weymouth in Boston Colony, where the people witnessed her words. Well, they were so excited that she did that the Puritan governor of Boston, John Endicott, who after cursing and threatening her, committed Herod and the girl that assisted her to the jailer, and they each received 10 stripes with the threefold cord of the covenant. That's basically a rope twisted into 3 parts, which gives it some biblical meaning. And it was said at the time that such a barbarous act, whipping a woman who had 2 babes, nursing them at the time, and after being whipped, she knelt and said, "The Lord forgive you, for you know not what you do." And another observer said that surely if she had not had the Spirit of the Lord, she could not do this thing. They were both then imprisoned for about 14 days. So not good times for Herod. So we went from feeling sorry for poor Herod, who was forced to marry at age 12, abandoned by her husband, bore all these children, and now became a member of the Quaker faith, potentially to leave her less pious partner, George Gardner. And so in some ways, after what she's done here, she's sort of Saint Herod in our eyes. Well, it's not quite that simple, because after some 20 years as the partner of George Gardner, Herod appears in another petition presented by a lady named Margaret, and she was the wife of the Quaker John Porter, who was a well-to-do inhabitant of Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And in her petition, she says that John had apparently left her without means of support and depended upon her children. She asked the court to make sure her husband provides for her. And they checked it out, and they said, boy, this poor ancient matron, she's about to be abandoned by this guy, so he can't transfer any of his wealth to anyone else until he takes care of her. They did exempt one thing, which was a conveyance that Porter had made to the governor, and that was left out. That was said that was okay to do. So sort of like the bribe's still good. So in 1665, after he took care of Margaret, his property was released. And so you may be saying, so why is Dan talking about this Margaret Porter person? What's she got to do with Herod? who, meanwhile, we were considering for sainthood. Well, it turns out that Herod had been living under the pretense of being John Porter's house servant. In the fall of 1667, an indictment was made against Mr. Porter and Herod for that they are suspected to cohabitat and so to live in a way of incontinency, which is a scandalous way of living, basically saying it was illegitimate. So Porter was called into court. He was acquitted, and then eventually Herod was pulled into court, and she was acquitted as well. So apparently money talks.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, it was. So then John and Herod got married. He was 25 years older than her. He gave a bunch of land to her children, and then when he died, his divorced wife Margaret actually executed his will. Meantime, George Gardner, at the age of 66, married a 40-year younger woman. And so now we know that it turns out dear Saint Herod was actually a homewrecker, and she was messing with my 10th great-grandma's marriage. So we don't know when Herod died, but she did leave several successful descendants, and one of them had some of her more scandalous DNA. So we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks and tell his story.
I can't wait. I'm interested in that part of the story for sure, Dan.
Yeah, there's definitely some scandalous DNA she handed down to one of her kids. So just as amazing of a story.
Well, I can't wait. You always share us a wealth of knowledge, and I appreciate it, and I look forward to the next week and the following week and just hearing all these historical stories, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.